Did medieval nuns all live the same austere life, dedicated purely to spiritual devotion and hard labor? Think again. What if some experienced lives of relative luxury, filled with fine foods and private chambers, while others struggled daily for basic sustenance and warmth within the same holy walls, perhaps around 1100 to 1500 AD? Get ready to uncover the surprising truths. Number 1. How they entered and what they brought with them. Getting into a medieval convent was not always about a divine calling. For a wealthy family, placing a daughter in a nunnery could be a strategic move, a way to secure her future without having to provide a massive dowry for marriage, or to prevent the division of family lands. These daughters, often from noble or wealthy merchant families, arrived with substantial dowries, a payment to the convent that guaranteed their place and often their comfort. This dowry could be a large sum of money, a significant piece of land, a collection of valuable goods like silver chalices, richly embroidered vestments, or even servants to assist the convent. Powerful noble family might present a gift of an entire manor or a steady annual income from a particular estate. These endowments were crucial for the convent's financial stability, and they secured the new nun a privileged position. When a rich daughter entered, her family might not just provide a lump sum. They could establish a perpetual endowment, ensuring that the convent received income from a specific mill, a tithe from a village, or rent from a bustling market stall, year after year. This direct financial contribution meant the convent could afford better food, maintain its buildings, and even expand its library. The nun from such a family often felt a direct connection to this ongoing financial support, understanding that her presence contributed to the convent's overall prosperity. She knew her family's name carried weight, not just in the secular world, but within the cloister as well. This gave her an unspoken sense of security, and often a quiet authority among her peers. For instance, records from some English convents, like Godstow Abbey or Amesbury, show patterns of wealthy aristocratic women entering with vast sums or properties. The daughter of a baron might arrive with a dowry that included a herd of cattle, a flock of sheep, several bolts of expensive cloth, and a chest filled with gold coins. This was not just a one-time transaction. It established a relationship. Her family would continue to patronize the convent, perhaps contributing to new building projects, donating valuable relics, or even funding new altars. This meant the nun herself, even after taking her vows, remained tied to her powerful family network, receiving letters, special visitors, and perhaps even additional comforts sent from her former home. Her entrance ceremony might have been grand, attended by her family, perhaps even local dignitaries. The gifts she brought would be formally presented, perhaps even paraded, a public display of her family's piety and wealth. Her transition into monastic life was often smooth, cushioned by the knowledge that her presence was a significant asset to the community. She would be assigned a comfortable cell, even finer clothing, and perhaps even given an easier path through her probationary period, her future assured by the wealth she brought with her. Now, let us turn to the other side. For a poor woman, entering a medieval convent was an entirely different experience, often a desperate one. She might have come from a peasant family, a struggling artisan household, or even been orphaned. Such families had no land to give, no gold coins to offer, and sometimes barely enough food for themselves. For these women, securing a place in a convent was often less about spiritual calling and more about survival, a chance to escape a life of harsh manual labor, potential starvation, or an arranged marriage that held no appeal. The dowry, if there was one, was meager. It might consist of a few coarse linen shirts, a worn blanket, a single cooking pot, or perhaps a small, often symbolic sum of copper coins. In many cases, there was no dowry at all. These convents, often smaller and less well endowed, sometimes accepted women without a dowry out of charity or because they desperately needed labor. A poor woman's entry was often conditional. She might be expected to perform the most arduous and undesirable tasks within the convent for years, effectively working off her debt for her place. She might spend her days washing laundry for the entire community, scrubbing floors, tending the kitchen gardens, or mending habits, performing the back-breaking labor that the wealthier nuns or their servants avoided. Records from less affluent convents, particularly those in more remote or struggling regions, often show a greater proportion of women accepted without substantial financial contributions. These convents might have been founded on the principle of charity, or simply lacked the patronage of powerful families. For a poor woman, the entrance ceremony would be simple, if it existed at all, beyond the formal taking of vows. There would be no grand procession of goods, no visiting dignitaries. Her family, if they could afford the journey, would likely be humble folk, sharing a quiet, perhaps tearful farewell. Her probationary period might be far more demanding, a true test of her endurance and obedience. She would be expected to prove her worth through diligence and hard work, demonstrating that she was a valuable addition to the community, not just a burden. Her living conditions would reflect her lack of dowry. A spot in a communal dormitory, the simplest of habits, and certainly no personal comforts. Her future within the convent depended entirely on her ability to integrate through service and hard labor, rather than the financial security she brought. Contrast between these two entry paths highlights the vast economic divide that existed even within the sacred walls of medieval religious life. Number 2, their daily diet and the quality of their food. The chime of the dinner bell resonated very differently for rich and poor nuns in a medieval convent. For a wealthy nun, mealtime was often a relatively pleasant affair, a chance to enjoy a varied and often luxurious diet. Her convent, bolstered by generous dowries and ongoing endowments, could afford to provision its kitchen with a wider array of foodstuffs. Their daily bread was typically made from finer sifted wheat flour, resulting in a wider, softer loaf. This manchet bread was a mark of quality and status, a stark contrast to the coarse, dark rye or barley bread consumed by the common populace. Fish was a staple, especially on the numerous fast days throughout the year when meat was forbidden. But for the wealthy convents, fish did not just mean dried or salted herring. They could afford fresh fish, perhaps caught in the convent's own fish ponds or purchased from nearby rivers and coasts. This included prized freshwater fish like pike, carp, and trout, or saltwater delicacies such as cod and mackerel prepared with care and skill. On non-fast days, or for special feasts, meat would appear on the menu, not just pork or beef, but sometimes venison, fowl like chicken or goose, or even smaller birds like pigeons, signifying a more elevated culinary experience. Vegetables from the convent's own extensive gardens were plentiful and diverse, providing fresh greens, root vegetables, and herbs that added flavor and nutrients. Rich convents could also afford to purchase exotic spices from merchants, pepper, ginger, cloves, cinnamon, which transformed simple dishes into flavorful culinary experiences. These spices were not just for taste, they were a status symbol, expensive and rare, demonstrating the convent's economic reach. Wine, often of decent quality, would be served at meals, a refined beverage rather than the common small beer or water drunk by the less fortunate. Even desserts, like fruit tarts, sweetened puddings, or candied fruits, might make an appearance on feast days. Kitchen staff in such convents would often be skilled cooks, perhaps even trained lay sisters or hired servants capable of preparing elaborate multi-course meals. The dining hall, or refectory, might be well lit and heated, adding to the comfort of the meal. Historical accounts, such as those detailing the provisions for major abbeys, like Shaftesbury, hint at a diet far more akin to that of a minor noble household than a place of austerity. These nuns might also receive special provisions from their families: a basket of fresh eggs, a joint of roasted meat, a pot of honey, or a fine cheese, supplementing their already generous diet and providing a taste of the outside world's luxuries. Such gifts were not just about food, they were a continuation of familial affection and a demonstration of ongoing status. Now, consider the daily diet of a poor medieval nun. Her meals were starkly different, dictated by the meager resources of her convent and the lack of a substantial dowry. Her bread was likely the coarse, dark stuff made from rye or barley flour, sometimes mixed with oats or even peas. It was heavy, rough, and designed primarily to fill the stomach rather than delight the palate. This was the most basic sustenance, often baked in large, irregular loaves that were then broken or cut into portions. Fish, when it appeared, was usually dried or salted herring, a cheap and readily available source of protein. It was often tough, requiring prolonged soaking and cooking, and its strong, salty taste was a constant presence in the diet. Meat was a rare luxury, perhaps only appearing on major feast days, or if the convent received an unexpected donation. If meat was served, it was typically the less desirable cuts or scraps used to flavor a communal pot of pottage. Pottage, a thick gruel like stew, formed the core of her diet. It was made from whatever grains and vegetables were available, perhaps oats, peas, beans, onions, and whatever wild greens could be gathered. It was bland, often watery, and provided basic calories but little variation in flavor or texture. Spices were unheard of. Herbs gathered from the convent grounds might add a slight aroma, but nothing approaching the complexity of flavors enjoyed by her wealthier sisters. Water was the primary beverage, or perhaps a weak, unsweetened small beer brewed from leftover grains, which provided a little energy but no luxury. Kitchen in a poor convent would be a more rudimentary affair, often staffed by the nuns themselves, including the poor nuns whose daily chores involved fetching water, chopping vegetables, and tending the fires. The refectory would be cold, often damp, and meals would be eaten quickly, without ceremony. There would be no private provisions, no special gifts from family. Every meal was a communal affair, with each nun receiving the same basic, often inadequate portion. Chronic hunger might be a subtle, persistent companion for these nuns, especially during lean seasons or bad harvests. The contrast in diet was not just about comfort. It impacted health, energy levels, and even morale. A well-fed nun had more energy for her spiritual duties, for study, and for the various administrative tasks of the convent. Poorly fed nun might suffer from chronic fatigue, malnutrition, and a greater susceptibility to illness. This fundamental difference in daily sustenance was a constant, tangible reminder of the economic chasm separating the rich from the poor, even within the consecrated walls of the convent. Number 3. Their clothing and personal comfort. The habit, the distinctive clothing of a nun, might seem uniform at first glance, yet the quality and comfort of this daily attire varied wildly between rich and poor medieval nuns. For a wealthy nun, her habit was not just a symbol of her vows, it was also a reflection of her family's status and the convent's prosperity. Her outer habit, typically a tunic and scapular, would be made from fine wool, soft, well-spun, and perhaps dyed with richer, more stable colors that did not fade quickly. This wool would offer better warmth in winter and be more breathable in summer, making her daily life significantly more comfortable. Underneath her habit, she would wear layers of fine linen which was smooth against the skin, less prone to itching and easier to keep clean. This was a significant comfort in an era without modern hygiene. Her wimple, the linen cloth covering her neck and chin, and her veil would also be made of good quality linen, neatly pressed and starched. Her shoes would be well made, perhaps of soft leather, custom fitted, providing adequate support and protection from the cold and damp of the cloister floors. She might even have a pair of softer indoor slippers for her private cell. During colder months, a wealthy nun would likely possess a heavier, finer wool cloak, possibly lined with fur or a softer fabric, providing substantial warmth. She might also have warm stockings made of fine wool. The overall impression was one of quiet dignity and comfort. Not ostentatious display, but a subtle indication of superior materials and craftsmanship. Her habit would be replaced regularly as it wore out, ensuring she always looked presentable and felt comfortable. These garments were often purchased from specialized textile merchants or made by skilled lay sisters within the convent, using the finest materials the convent could afford. Furthermore, a wealthy nun might have a few personal items that added to her comfort, though strictly speaking, the rule often forbade personal possessions. These could include a more comfortable mattress made of feathers or finely stuffed straw, a softer pillow, or a personal blanket of good quality wool. These small luxuries, while not flaunted, made a substantial difference to daily well-being, especially during the long, cold medieval nights. The concept of personal comfort for these nuns was not about indulgence, but about mitigating the harsh realities of monastic life with the best available materials. In stark contrast, the poor medieval nun's habit was a constant source of discomfort and a visible marker of her low status. Her outer habit would be made from the coarsest, cheapest wool available, rough, scratchy, and prone to pilling. It would be poorly dyed, often a dull, earthy brown or gray, and would fade quickly, giving her an appearance of perpetual shabbiness. This rough fabric would irritate her skin, especially during long hours of prayer or labor. Her undergarments would be of the roughest linen or even hemp, providing little comfort. Her wimple and veil would be made of similar coarse material, often unbleached and poorly maintained. Her shoes would be simple, ill-fitting, often made of stiff leather, and would wear out quickly, offering inadequate protection from the cold and damp. She might often go barefoot in warmer weather or within the convent halls due to worn-out footwear. A poor nun's habit would not be replaced often. She would mend and patch her garments meticulously, wearing them until they were threadbare, a testament to necessity rather than choice. Patches themselves would often be made from whatever scraps of fabric were available, adding to the haphazard appearance. She might not have a proper winter cloak, relying instead on extra layers of her thin habit or simply enduring the cold. Warm stockings were a luxury she likely never knew. Her personal comforts were virtually non-existent. Her mattress would be a thin layer of straw, often damp and infested, laid directly on the hard floor or on a simple wooden pallet in a communal dormitory. Her pillow, if she had one, would be a small, hard sack filled with straw. Her blanket would be thin, scratchy, and often shared with others in the dormitory. Sleep was a constant struggle for warmth and relief. The constant physical discomfort of her clothing and bedding would be a daily reminder of her position, affecting her ability to sleep soundly, focus during prayers, and perform her duties without distraction. This difference in even the most basic necessities, like clothing and bedding, highlighted the deep chasm of comfort between the rich and the poor within the very heart of medieval monastic life. Number 4. Their education and intellectual pursuits. Education in medieval convents was not a universal experience. It was heavily stratified by wealth and status. For a wealthy medieval nun, the convent could be a vibrant center of learning, a place where she might pursue intellectual interests to a degree rarely afforded to women outside the cloister. Her family's dowry and ongoing patronage ensured the convent could maintain a substantial library filled with a diverse collection of manuscripts. These could include theological texts, liturgical works, classical literature, philosophical treatises, and even scientific or medical texts. Access to these books was a priceless treasure in an age when books were painstakingly copied by hand and incredibly rare. She would be taught to read and write, not just in Latin, the language of the Church, but often in the vernacular languages of her region, like French or English. Her education might extend to Greek or Hebrew if the convent had particularly learned scholars or rare texts. Beyond literacy, she would receive instruction in grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, and perhaps even astronomy. Music was often a key part of her education, learning to chant the divine office with precision and beauty, perhaps even learning to play an instrument like the harp or lute. Some wealthy convents even employed private tutors or scholarly priests to provide advanced instruction to their more gifted or well-connected nuns. These nuns might be trained as scribes, meticulously copying manuscripts in beautiful calligraphy and illuminating them with intricate designs. This was not just a practical skill. It was an artistic and intellectual pursuit, preserving knowledge and creating new works. They might also engage in correspondence with learned scholars outside the convent walls, contributing to the intellectual discourse of their time. For women like Hotzwied of Gandersheim, a 10th century German canoness, or Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, intellectual pursuits within the convent led to significant contributions in literature, drama, music, and natural history, all made possible by the resources of their wealthy foundations. These nuns were often destined for positions of leadership within the convent, such as abbess, prioress, or mistress of the novices. Their extensive education prepared them for the complex administrative, spiritual, and intellectual demands of such roles, allowing them to manage large estates, oversee building projects, and engage in diplomatic relations with powerful secular figures. Their intellectual lives were rich and stimulating, providing a continuous path for personal growth and spiritual deepening. Contrast this with the poor medieval nun. For her, formal education was often minimal, if it existed at all, beyond basic religious instruction. Her convent, struggling financially, could not afford extensive libraries or dedicated tutors. Books were scarce, perhaps a few worn liturgical texts and a basic Bible, usually kept under lock and key and not easily accessible to all. Her primary education would be practical and oral, learning the prayers and chants by rote, memorizing passages of scripture, and understanding the basic tenets of her faith. Literacy was not a given. Many poor nuns learned only enough to recognize the words of the liturgy, if that writing was an even rarer skill. Her intellectual pursuits were limited to what she could glean from sermons, communal readings, and the oral traditions of the convent. There was no time or resources for the study of classical texts, philosophy, or advanced mathematics. Her hands were needed for labor, not for copying manuscripts or poring over ancient texts. Her contributions to the convent were physical, not intellectual. She cleaned, cooked, gardened, and performed the countless manual tasks that kept the community running. While her work was essential, it left little time or energy for scholarly pursuits. She might have a rudimentary understanding of herbal remedies learned through practical experience in the infirmary, but not the systematic medical knowledge available to wealthier sisters. For a poor nun, the concept of a library might have been a single shelf containing a handful of books, some of which were old and damaged. Her learning was rooted in practical piety and communal experience, rather than individual study. She might have found spiritual fulfillment in her devotion and labor, but the doors to the wider world of knowledge and intellectual exploration were largely closed to her. This fundamental disparity in educational access meant that a poor nun's life was often one of physical toil and basic spiritual observance, while her wealthier sisters explored the depths of theological thought and the breadth of human knowledge, shaping their worlds in vastly different ways. Number 5. Their workload and daily tasks. The daily rhythm of a medieval nun's life was governed by the monastic horarium, a strict timetable of prayers, communal meals, and duties. However, the nature and intensity of these duties differed dramatically based on a nun's economic background. For a wealthy medieval nun, her daily tasks were often lighter, more intellectual or administrative, befitting her status and the convent's financial resources. She might spend her mornings in contemplation, study, or prayer, free from the heavy manual labor that occupied her poorer sisters. Her duties might involve managing the convent's extensive estates, overseeing land agreements, or corresponding with powerful secular figures regarding legal or financial matters. These administrative tasks required literacy, numeracy, and a degree of social finesse, skills she would have acquired through her privileged education. She might be involved in the convent's scriptorium, meticulously copying and illuminating manuscripts, a skilled and time-consuming artistic endeavor rather than a chore. This work was a form of devotion, but also a mark of intellectual distinction. Other wealthy nuns might be assigned roles like sacristan, responsible for the care of the altar, sacred vessels, and vestments, a task often involving intricate embroidery and the handling of precious objects. Or she might be the infirmarian, overseeing the convent's infirmary, applying her knowledge of herbal remedies and administering care, sometimes with the assistance of hired lay physicians or servants. Teaching the novices, especially those from noble families, was another common duty for educated, well-connected nuns, involving instruction in Latin, music, and the complex etiquette of monastic life. These roles required intellect, precision, and often a certain amount of authority, but they did not involve back-breaking physical labor. The wealthy nuns often had a degree of personal space and quiet time to pursue their spiritual and intellectual duties without the constant interruptions of heavy chores. They might also engage in fine needlework, creating exquisite altar cloths or vestments, a highly valued craft that contributed to the beauty of the convent and its spiritual life, often using expensive materials like silk and gold thread. Historical records of convents like Barking Abbey or Shaftesbury show a sophisticated administrative structure run by highly capable nuns, many of whom came from aristocratic backgrounds. Now, shift your gaze to the poor medieval nun. Her daily workload was defined by relentless physical labor, the unseen engine that kept the convent functioning. Her days began early, often before dawn, and stretched long into the evening, filled with the most demanding and often unpleasant chores. She was the backbone of the convent's manual operations, performing the tasks that wealthy nuns and their servants avoided. Her duties included preparing food for the entire community. This meant hours spent in the kitchen, stoking fires, fetching water from the well, chopping vegetables, grinding grains, and cooking large vats of pottage. She might be responsible for cleaning the refectory, the dormitory, and the communal latrines, tasks that were physically demanding and often unpleasant, particularly in an age without modern sanitation. Laundry was another ceaseless chore. Clothes had to be washed by hand, often in cold water, pounded clean, rinsed, and then dried. This was heavy, repetitive work, especially for a large community. Tending the convent gardens, digging, planting, weeding, harvesting, was also her domain, providing much of the community's food. This was seasonal, weather-dependent work that could be exhausting. She might also be responsible for spinning wool into thread, weaving fabric for habits and blankets, mending garments, or carrying water and firewood to different parts of the convent. If the convent had animals, she might be involved in their care, milking cows, tending chickens, or mucking out stables. These tasks were not optional. They were essential for the convent's survival and her own place within it. There was little time for quiet contemplation or intellectual pursuits. Her hands were always busy, her body often tired and aching. Her day was a continuous cycle of physical demands, reflecting her lack of dowry and the necessity of her labor to the convent's functioning. This fundamental difference in workload highlights how deeply economic disparity shaped the everyday reality of a nun's life, transforming the monastic ideal of communal service into a stark division of labor between the privileged and the perpetually toiling. Number 6. Their living quarters and privacy. Concept of a cell in a medieval convent conjures images of a small, Spartan room. Yet for rich and poor nuns, the reality of their living quarters and the degree of privacy they enjoyed differed dramatically, reflecting their social and economic standing within the cloister. For a wealthy medieval nun, her living quarters were often a private cell, a room of her own that offered a significant degree of comfort and personal space. These cells, especially in larger, well-endowed convents, were more akin to small apartments than austere cubicles. They might be built around a quiet cloister garth, offering views of a garden or courtyard. Her cell would typically be equipped with a proper wooden bed frame, not just a straw pallet on the floor. Her mattress would be stuffed with feathers or fine straw, offering a softer, more comfortable night's sleep. She would have clean, good quality linen sheets and woolen blankets, perhaps even a personal quilt or coverlet sent from her family. A small, often carved chest or coffer would provide storage for her personal possessions, which, despite the rule of poverty, often included a few treasured books, writing materials, a personal devotional image, or even a small piece of jewelry discreetly kept from her past life. Crucially, many wealthy nuns' cells featured a small fireplace or brazier for warmth, a luxury beyond imagination for their poorer sisters. This meant she could keep her room at a more comfortable temperature during the cold medieval winters. Her cell might also have a small window, perhaps with a window seat, allowing light and air and a quiet place for reading or contemplation. The walls might be whitewashed, or in some cases even decorated with simple painted patterns or hung with tapestries sent by her family. These touches made her private space feel more homely and less like a bare enclosure. Access to such a private cell was a privilege, signifying her family's importance and the substantial dowry they provided. It allowed her a degree of solitude and quiet for prayer, study, and personal reflection, fostering a sense of individual spiritual journey that was harder to achieve in communal settings. These individual cells were a tangible representation of the convent's wealth and its ability to provide comfortable living conditions for its most valued members. Now turn to the poor medieval nun. Her living quarters were a stark contrast, offering virtually no privacy and minimal comfort. She lived in a communal dormitory, a large, unheated hall filled with rows of simple wooden pallets or straw mattresses laid directly on the floor. Her sleeping space was defined by the scant area her pallet occupied, with only a thin shared blanket or two for warmth. There were no private cells for these nuns. Every aspect of their personal life, from dressing to sleeping, was conducted in the presence of others. The dormitory was often cold, damp, and poorly ventilated, making sleep difficult, especially during the harsh medieval winters. The straw mattresses were prone to dampness, pests, and quickly became uncomfortable. Personal possessions were almost non-existent. She might have a small bag or bundle for her few worn belongings, a patched habit, a rosary, a worn prayer book, if she was fortunate enough to possess one. There was no chest, no personal storage, no place to keep anything private. Lighting would be minimal, perhaps a single communal lamp or candelabra, offering little illumination for individual activities after dark. There were no fireplaces, no windows for personal enjoyment, only the communal openings for ventilation that let in the elements. The lack of privacy was pervasive. There was no quiet corner to retreat to, no personal sanctuary for private prayer or study. Every action was communal, every sound shared. This constant lack of personal space could be emotionally draining, offering little respite from the demands of communal life and the absence of individual solace. Communal dormitory reflected the poor nun's lack of economic contribution to the convent. She was there through charity or because her labor was needed, and her living conditions reflected this dependency. Her life was fundamentally public, with every aspect of her daily routine observed by her sisters. This stark difference in living arrangements, the private, comfortable cell versus the communal, austere dormitory, was one of the most visible and enduring reminders of the economic divide between rich and poor medieval nuns, shaping their experience of monastic life in profoundly different ways. Number 7. Their medical care and health. When illness struck in a medieval convent, the quality of care a nun received depended heavily on her convent's wealth and, by extension, her own financial background. For a wealthy medieval nun, falling ill, while certainly unpleasant, was often met with relatively sophisticated medical attention for the era. Her convent, benefiting from substantial endowments, could maintain a well-stocked infirmary, a dedicated building or wing designed for the sick. This infirmary might have individual sick rooms, offering privacy and quiet, a stark contrast to the communal dormitories. The infirmary would be equipped with a decent supply of herbal remedies, some grown in the convent's own physic garden, others purchased from apothecaries or merchants. These included a wide array of medicinal herbs, poultices, and tinctures, often prepared by a skilled infirmarian nun or a lay sister who had extensive knowledge of medieval medicine. Convent might even be able to afford the services of a visiting physician from a nearby town, a trained professional who could offer diagnoses and treatments beyond basic herbalism. These physicians, while limited by medieval medical knowledge, represented the pinnacle of contemporary healthcare. A wealthy nun might receive a special diet when ill, consisting of nourishing broths, soft foods, or even wine believed to have medicinal properties. She would be kept warm, provided with clean linen, and perhaps even allowed specific comforts not permitted in her daily life, such as a fire in her room or more frequent visits from the infirmarian. The emphasis was on comfort, rest, and careful treatment to aid recovery. Records from prosperous convents often mention expenditures on special foods for the sick or payments to outside healers, illustrating the premium placed on the well-being of their most valued members. Furthermore, wealthy nuns often came from families who continued to care for their welfare. If an illness was severe or prolonged, her family might send additional provisions, specific remedies from their own estates, better quality food, or even arrange for her to be temporarily moved to a family home for recovery, though this was rare and required special dispensation. The general hygiene of a wealthy convent, with its better access to clean water, proper drainage, and more spacious living conditions, also contributed to better overall health, reducing the spread of disease. Now consider the poor medieval nun struck by illness. Her experience would be far more bleak and often perilous. Her convent, struggling with limited funds, would likely have a rudimentary infirmary, perhaps just a designated corner of a communal room, or a small cramped chamber shared by multiple sick nuns. There would be little to no privacy, and the conditions would be cold, damp, and uncomfortable. The supply of herbal remedies would be limited to what could be gathered locally, or what the convent itself could grow in a small, perhaps neglected garden. Many of the more effective or expensive remedies would be out of reach. There would be no visiting physician. Medical care would be provided by a less trained infirmarian nun, relying on basic folk remedies, prayers, and common sense. Serious conditions often went untreated, and the likelihood of recovery from severe illnesses was significantly lower. When ill, a poor nun would receive the same coarse bread and thin pottage as the healthy nuns, or perhaps a slightly thinner gruel. There would be no special diets or comforts. Her only solace might be the communal prayers of her sisters. Her bedding, already rough, would become even more uncomfortable with prolonged illness. She would lie on a hard straw mattress, often shivering, sharing her discomfort with others in the same room. The lack of proper sanitation in less affluent convents also meant a higher risk of infection and the quicker spread of contagious diseases among the community. For a poor nun, chronic illness was a constant threat, and recovery was often slow or incomplete. If her illness was debilitating, her usefulness to the convent would diminish, potentially leading to a more precarious existence. There would be no family intervention, no special provisions from the outside. Her fate rested entirely on the limited resources and charitable spirit of her struggling community. The disparity in medical care was not just about comfort, it was often a matter of life and death, highlighting how deeply socioeconomic status permeated every aspect of a medieval nun's existence, even in the face of spiritual dedication. Number 8. Their social connections and influence. The walls of a medieval convent might have seemed to separate nuns from the secular world, but for many, especially the wealthy, these walls were porous, allowing for a continuation of powerful social connections and influence. For a wealthy medieval nun, her entry into the convent did not necessarily sever her ties to her powerful family. In fact, it often solidified them. These nuns often came from noble or wealthy merchant families who continued to wield significant political and economic power in the region. Their presence in the convent meant their family had a direct stake in its well-being, often leading to continued patronage, donations, and protection. An abbess from a noble family, for example, could leverage her familial connections to secure land grants for the convent, negotiate favorable deals with local lords or bishops, or even mediate disputes. Her sisters might be married to powerful nobles, her brothers knights or high-ranking clergy, and these connections translated into influence for the convent itself. Letters would pass frequently between the convent and her family, keeping her informed of secular affairs and allowing her to offer advice or use her influence from within the cloister. Wealthy nuns might receive frequent visits from their families, bringing news, gifts, and maintaining the familial bond. These visits were often elaborate affairs, requiring special arrangements and perhaps even private rooms within the convent's guest house for the visitors. Such interactions kept the nun connected to the broader aristocratic network, offering her a sense of continuity with her former life and a continued platform for social engagement, albeit in a spiritual context. Some wealthy nuns even used their position to act as intermediaries, arranging marriages for younger relatives or interceding on behalf of their family in political matters. Furthermore, within the convent itself, a wealthy nun often held a higher social standing. She might be elected to positions of authority such as abbess, prioress, or cellarer, responsible for provisions, not just due to her piety or intellect, but also because her family's connections brought prestige and security to the community. Her voice would carry more weight in communal decisions, and her opinions would be sought out due to her worldly knowledge and connections. Her position was not just about spiritual service. It was also about managing a complex institution that functioned as a significant landowner and social entity in medieval society. These nuns, like powerful medieval noblewomen, were often shrewd administrators and diplomats, using their family name and their convent's resources to navigate a complex world. Now consider the poor medieval nun. Her social connections and influence were virtually non-existent, reflecting her humble origins and lack of economic contribution. Her family, if they were still alive and known to her, were likely peasants, artisans, or urban laborers. They had no political power, no land to bestow, and no wealth to leverage. Their visits to the convent, if they occurred at all, would be rare, difficult to arrange, and without ceremony. They would sit in a public parlor, share simple farewells, and depart quickly, unable to offer any material support or external influence. For a poor nun, the convent represented a complete break from her former life. She entered with little to no family support, and her family had no means to continue patronizing the convent. She was truly dependent on the charity and resources of the religious community itself. She would not receive special letters from powerful relatives or act as a political intermediary. Her world shrank to the confines of the convent walls, her daily interactions limited to her immediate sisters and the communal life. Within the convent, her social standing was typically at the bottom of the hierarchy. She would not be elected to positions of authority. Her duties were primarily those of manual labor, not administration or diplomacy. Her voice in communal decisions would be less significant, perhaps rarely even heard beyond her immediate circle of friends. She relied on the goodwill of the abbess and her wealthier sisters for her place and sustenance. Her influence, if any, was entirely personal, based on her character, piety, or perhaps her diligence in labor, rather than any external connections. Her life was one of anonymity and service, with little opportunity to shape events beyond her immediate chores. She was a beneficiary of the convent's charity, not a contributor to its worldly power. This stark contrast in social reach and influence highlights how even within the supposedly egalitarian spiritual life, the enduring power of wealth and aristocratic lineage continued to shape the lives and opportunities of medieval nuns in fundamentally different ways.